Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride. Let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshifted.net/079, and you can email the show, pedalshift@pedalshift.net. Check out Pedalshift also on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Big hello to everybody. This is Tim Mooney back for another edition of the Pedalshift Project. On this episode, we're going to be talking about some June tour ideas that I have. I'm not doing a tour in May, but I'm planning for one in June. I just don't know where it's going to be yet, and I've got a few ideas, so I thought I would share those on the show. One of those ideas is actually a brand new route that has been dreamed up by a former board member of the Adventure Cycling Association, and I had the great pleasure to speak with him, and we will have that interview as part of the show as well, talking all about the Eastern Express, and we'll get all into what that means in a little bit. We'll start the show up with some follow-up. So quick follow-up on the Pedalshift guide to bicycling the C&O towpath. It is brand new and newly updated. I've done a bunch of work on it. So if you checked it out before and it was a little bit thin, I agree, it was. Now it is much more substantially populated. So here's a few of the things that have happened over there. If you're interested in checking it out, it's at pedalshift.net/C&O, all spelled out. I have the entire route segmented into about 10-mile chunks. I found with a lot of the resources out there that they tend to be on longer chunks, and I do think that I look at most of the trail in 10-mile sections. It just sort of behaves a little bit differently, roughly in 10-mile sections. So I thought that was a good way to take a look at it. It's also a good way to look at it because it takes about an hour or so, depending, all sorts of variables, of course. But I find that I average about 10 miles per hour on the trail, which is slower than normal for maybe asphalt riding or things like that. But a lot of the times it's also just because I'm looking around and I'm enjoying stuff. And even if the trail conditions could warrant a little bit faster ride, I end up going about 10 miles per hour, really no matter what. So segmented into 10-mile chunks for your kind of enjoyment. Also, I've added descriptions over the rest of some of the ends of the trail, especially the DC end. I'm going to be adding more descriptions throughout the rest of the spring. That's something I'm going to be slowly adding as we go along. The things that I have added that I think are a little bit helpful, I've embedded maps for each of the 10-mile sections, and they're just regular old Google Maps, but it's helpful to get an idea of the sort of terrain and, more importantly, what it looks like as you hug the river. Because what's really interesting is that there are opportunities to get off the trail and do some shortcuts because of the way the river bends, if you so want to, but also just so you know where you are relative to the trail. It's really amazing how this little ribbon of green can really take you away from a lot of places, and I think it's always helpful to know where you are relative to everything. So embedded maps. I've also embedded all of those video campsite reviews, which I think are a really nice thing for you to be able to take a look at if you're planning a ride, just because, you know what, knowing what you expect is really kind of nice, especially if you're, say, a hammock camper. I've got videos of all of these things, so you can kind of check out where the trees are if it's a good hammock type of campsite or not. The nice thing is by taking a look ahead of time, you'll know, well, if I want to end my day at maybe a variety of different options, you'll know what to expect at each of those options as you go along. Of course, that's if you're camping. If you're not camping, just check it out because it's pretty. Lots more to come. I'm really excited about this, and I'm looking for more expansion on the Pedalshift guide to bicycling the C&O Canal. So check all of that out at pedalshift.net/C&O. Next up on the show is the journal. The journal, of course, is the section of the program where we talk about tours, your tours, my tours. I am, as I talked about at the top of the show, planning for some kind of June tour. And if it's not June, then the next tour. I do think that I'm going to be able to get away sometime in June. This year is a little unusual for me. in that it is harder for me to plan out the spring, especially the late spring and into early summer, compared to normal. Last few years, I've been able to definitively know when I had some time. This year, there's just a variety of things going on, so I'm a little bit more circumspect in terms of my planning. But I think I've got it narrowed down to at least a couple of different options. The first is revisiting the West Coast again, but doing a different chunk than I've been doing the last year or so. I think that I would like to redo, and I think I've talked about this on the show, the ride from Portland to San Francisco. I just love that ride so much, but I've done it so many times. The part of the West Coast that I haven't done as much, and in fact, I've only done it the one time when I did the whole coast, is Washington State. Now, if you've listened to especially episode 10, 010 of the Pedalshift Project, you know that, or of course, Pedalshift Tour Journals Volume 1 for sort of the more pimped out version of it. I didn't enjoy Washington State as much as other parts of the Pacific Coast. That said, having just been out there recently, I think it sort of is beckoning once again. I also think that I would like to do the alternative route. There are two ways that you can do the Washington State coast. Number one is to do the inside route along sort of Puget Sound. And that's the way that I did it. That was because it was a little bit faster, and I perceived that I would enjoy that a little bit more. Turns out I didn't enjoy that as much as I expected to. I think that what I'm going to do this time, should I choose this, would be to do a little bit of island hopping and to check out the Pacific coast. So go on the outside edge of the Olympic Peninsula. You go through some very interesting towns, some old timber towns, and some other really beautiful areas, and there's some beautiful tidal pools. I haven't been there since I moved away from Portland, so it would be a nice opportunity to revisit those areas. At low tide, it's one of the most beautiful places on earth with the tidal pools there. Not that Oregon is much of a slouch, but it's really nice there too. So anyways, that's what I'm thinking in terms of doing Washington. I would probably end up doing a little bit of a multimodal thing and end up back in Portland again. Something along those lines, but really focusing north of Portland rather than south, which is what I tend to do. Another idea that I'm thinking about is Vancouver Island. Now, those of you, again, who were either with the show or have listened to episode 10 or Pedalshift Tour Journals Volume 1, you know that, of course, I hit Vancouver Island really briefly at the very beginning of that 2014 Pacific Coast Tour. And Vancouver Island includes, of course, the beautiful town of Victoria, which is the capital of British Columbia. Really cool town, but also Sydney and a few other different places as well. I have heard really wonderful things about Vancouver Island, and the prospect of maybe doing a tour circumnavigating it is pretty appealing to me. So that's another one that I'm thinking about as well. So maybe it could be some combination where I do a little bit of island hopping, then end up on the Olympic Peninsula. That could be something like that where I combine the two. But those are the ones that I'm looking at. The question, of course, is going to be, what bike do I want to use? I, of course, have the Green Goblin that sits in Portland, but if my tour makes more sense to begin in Seattle, then I'm toying with doing this by Brompton. And I'm going to be talking about this in the next episode, talking about lightening my load. I've been really focused on trying to figure out ways to make that Brompton touring kit even smaller and try to 86 that backpack. And I've talked about that on past shows. Of course, last year's California tour. You can go check out past shows on that. I'm looking at a much lighter setup that would still include a temp, would still include all of the various things that I really truly need and virtually nothing else. So it's kind of fascinating seeing what you can do. And then also having the ability to make that packable and travelable in an airplane, on a train, all of the different buses that could be part of a multimodal tour with that Brompton. So anyways, that's one of the question marks, I would say, for a Northwest tour, any of the variety of ones that I've talked about. And I'm really excited. I do want to do something in that area. If not in June, then I think perhaps this year I want to try to be able to carve out enough time to be able to do something up there. It's another opportunity to go see family again, of course, and to just kind of hang out in the Northwest in the summer. It's truly, truly amazing up there. So thinking about that. Option 2, I guess I've given us several options within that option 1. We'll call option 1 West Coast. Option 2 the Eastern Express. So, since we were last together a few weeks ago for episode 78, I stumbled upon a brand new bicycle touring route. And as I later learned, and you'll hear, it's been public since about December or so, but I was only discovering it, probably around the 1st or 2nd of May, give or take. And it is an invention by a former board member of the Adventure Cycling Association, and it's an alternative eastern section to the Trans Am. Now, let's talk about the Trans Am for a second. That's the Transamerica Route. We talked about that with Michael Risica on a past show, friend of the show. And we've talked about it with lots of other folks as well. It is probably the most famous cross-country route, probably the most traveled cross-country route that we have in the United States. The one challenge with it is that it goes through parts of the country that I'm interested in. I would be interested in cycling through it perhaps, but not as high of a priority as others. So along comes the Eastern Express, and you can go check that out at easternexpressroute.com. And we're going to be dropping that website a few more times, trust me. The fascinating thing about it is that it is an alternative way to get from the East Coast and hooks up eventually with the main trunk of the Trans Am back in Colorado. So how does it do that? This is the magic. It starts here in Washington, D.C., where I live and where I'm mostly located. And it uses the C&O and then the GAP to get up to Pittsburgh, and then uses some other trails to get across into Ohio, and then goes on from there and eventually hooks up with the Katy Trail, which is another trail that I've been intrigued with doing. Eventually gets you to Fort Collins through some serendipity. Fort Collins, Colorado, which is an amazing bicycling town, which I've never been to and have really wanted to go to. That is precisely 2,000 miles from Washington, D.C. That looks like a really intriguing, interesting trip. If I was able to piece together enough time to be able to pull something like that off, that would be a great alternative to doing a full cross country, because Fort Collins, at that point, I would have the ability to find ways to get back to DC, or perhaps doing it in reverse, going to Fort Collins and then bicycling back. Very intrigued by all of this. If I don't have enough time to be able to pull together that would probably take more than a month to get all the way out to Colorado, maybe doing some other option where it's basically starting in DC, doing the C&O and the GAP, which is something I really love doing and don't mind doing again, but then being able to go beyond Pittsburgh and going to maybe Steubenville, Ohio, or maybe even beyond that, and then maybe returning. It just sort of depends on how much time I can carve out. But I'm really intrigued about this Eastern Express, and I was so intrigued. This is what we call a segue in the biz, kids. I reached out to Frank Mortiz, who basically invented the route. So I wanted to introduce you to him before we got into the interview. Frank Mortiz is a veteran adventure cycling tour leader, instructor, and board member, and has completed the initial research to create the Eastern Express addition to the legendary Transamerica bike route. This new route provides a welcome option for Trans Am cyclists to bypass the severe mountain climbs and nasty dogs that confront cyclists in southwestern Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and southern Missouri on the eastern half of the existing route. It also replaces 3 major high-altitude climbs in Colorado with 1 gradual and scenic climb to the Continental Divide. Amazingly, almost 600 of the 2,100-plus miles of this route are on dedicated bike and pedestrian paths, towpaths, or rail trails. So, without further ado, here comes Frank. Pleased to have Frank Mortiz here joining us on the Pedalshift Project. Hello, Frank. How are you?
I'm fine. Good to talk to you, Tim.
It's fantastic to talk to you. I am speaking with the originator, the creator, the inventor, if you will, of the Eastern Express route, which you can find at easternexpressroute.com. And Frank, I wanted to get a little bit of a sense of your background in bicycle touring, because you have a rich history. You've worked with the Adventure Cycling Association, and you've done a lot of riding yourself. So share what you'd like with our listeners about what your background is.
Yeah, as far as bicycling, I started back in the D.C. area, lived in Bethesda in D.C., and I started bicycling back there with the Potomac Peddlers, and also occasionally commuted to work by bike. Retired from my job in '97, moved out to Colorado, and since then, well, at least 15 years after, I was a bike tour leader for both Adventure Cycling Association and for a Denver-based company called Timberline Adventures. I was also a leader instructor for adventure cycling, and I served on their board of directors. So I'm pretty heavily invested in bicycle travel.
Before we get into the whole Eastern Express route, I'm curious about the background as a member of the board of directors of Adventure Cycling Association, because obviously it has such a prominent role in bicycle touring here in the United States. What were the types of things that you would do in that role? I assume that it had a very strategic kind of vision for all of this. I'm curious, if to the extent you're able to share that, of course, what was that kind of like, and how did your role fit into all of that?
Well, like any board of directors, you provide governance for the organization, and adventure cycling has now grown to nearly 50,000 members, which is pretty impressive. I think it's the largest bicycle travel organization in the United States, if not the world. The role of the board was to make sure that the vision and mission was staying pretty consistent, especially with what the members wanted. And the idea basically is that you inspire and you make possible for people to travel by bicycle. They do the inspiration through a every other month magazine, probably one of the best bicycling magazines that's out there, called Adventure Cyclist. And their main mission, the thing that probably differentiates them from anyone else, is that since 1976, they have researched and mapped a bicycle route system throughout the United States, including one of the only mountain bike routes, which goes from Alberta, Canada, down to the Mexico border across the continental divide of the U.S. They also have 3 major cross-country routes that go from coast to coast in this country. And it's a major task keeping up that research, in addition to which they take on at least one new bike route development every year. So they are up to several tens of thousands of miles of bicycle routes. And the other mission that they've taken on is that they are the broker, working with State Department of Transportations across the country to develop what's called the U.S. Bike Route System, where there will be officially designated and signed bicycle routes that will appear on state road maps. So it's a pretty robust set of organizational principles and activities that they're undertaking. And it's quite a job to make sure that it keeps itself focused on the right targets.
Yeah, absolutely. One of those routes is the Transamerica Route, and it's I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's the original route across the country. It is kind of the focus of your alternative Eastern Express route. Before we sort of get into what you've created, I'm curious about your thoughts on the Transamerica Route, because I think that your point of view on the eastern side of it was what prompted you to create this alternative route. Tell me what you think about the Trans Am route right now.
The original Transamerica Route was created by what was then called Bike Centennial, to basically serve as a route for a cross-country ride to celebrate the bicentennial of the U.S. in 1976. And it was researched over a period of 2 years. If you look at it going from east to west, it starts down near Yorktown, Virginia on the east coast, goes down through southwestern Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and across the Ohio and Mississippi rivers through southern Missouri into Kansas. Then when it gets to Colorado, it sort of heads north until it gets to Missoula, Montana, and then heads west from there. So it's at the time they were looking for a route that was both bicycling safe as well as scenic and had some historical interest. In 2001, they created what's called the Western Express, and that's a route that's much more direct going from San Francisco across the Nevada and Utah deserts to come into Pueblo, Colorado. And my thought was, I led their self-contained cross-country trip on the Trans Am for adventure cycling in 2007. And it convinced me that all of the feedback we'd been getting from riders for years was true. That is that the segment that goes through southwestern Virginia and Kentucky, basically cutting through the Appalachians and through the Ozarks and southern Missouri, is, first of all, physically difficult. Both the numbers, the steepness, and the distance of the hills climbed are very rigorous. However, that was the best they could find as far as getting through the Appalachians, back in '76. And the other element that makes it, in my opinion, a little less than inspiring is that, quite frankly, those parts of the country are some of the most economically depressed in the country. And what's happened as a result of basically the impoverishment of those areas is that there are very few support services for a cyclist or for any traveler at all going through that area. There's a large segment of 2 days of riding from the border of Virginia and Kentucky until you get to Boonesboro, Kentucky, that's hanging on the thread of the goodwill of a historical society in Hmmm, Kentucky, that basically allows travelers to camp out on their lawn. So I've been concerned with some time, both about the aesthetics of that section of the route, as well as the survival of support systems for people. That's true in general of almost all of our major adventure cycling cross-country routes. One of the things that's happened over the course of the last several decades with the big boxing of American stores is that these small towns that we love to ride through on the back roads have lost all of their support services like grocery stores and campgrounds and that sort of thing, because the services have all become concentrated on the interstates and the major U.S. highways, none of which we want to ride on if we can avoid it. So for years, people have been asking adventure cycling, is there any way that you can put together something easier, by which they mean, is there any way to get through the Appalachian Mountains that's different? And what happened probably in the early to mid 2000s, the final piece fell into place that allowed me to do that and to find a new route, which was the opening and completion of the Great Allegheny Passage rail trail, which goes from Cumberland, Maryland to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so several years ago, I started undertaking the research on that. But basically, this is, I termed it the Eastern Express simply because it seemed like a natural counterpart to what already existed as the Western Express. So that's the background.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that really detailed vision of it. The thing that you've been saying about Kentucky in particular in that section is something that I've heard as well. We've done some interviews on this show within the last year of folks who've done the Trans Am. And one person that I've spoken to in particular, Michael Risico, who's a friend of the show, literally does not want to go through Kentucky anymore because of some of the things that you've said, but also just he's had some bad riding experiences. It's a heavily trucked route as well, and some other things where there's been a degradation of just the riding experience. So I think that the time for the Eastern Express is well timed. So I'm curious how long you talked about this being something that you've researched over the years. How long did it take for you to develop this route? Like, when did you start to? When did your website launch, roughly?
The website launched in December of last year, and I would say I worked on it for 3 to 4 years. It's time consuming, and it's time consuming because as a tour leader, I have a good acquaintance with what's really required to have a safe, scenic, and basically enjoyable ride. And so you can't just draw a straight line from here to there. And it's also something that I could not work on full time. but I'd actually spent many years developing routes, shorter routes for rides for adventure cycling. In fact, about over a dozen of the rides that is offered by the Tourist Department of Adventure Cycling were routes that I created. And one of the things you find out as a tour leader is that when you're taking a group of people as opposed to people traveling solo or in twos or threes, is that your logistical and safety requirements are considerably different. And that if you design a route that's adequate to provide both safety and good support for a group of 12 to 15 people, then the route will support just about any size group, and especially for the onesies and twosies who are going to ride on the route. So basically, off and on, I spent the last 3 to 4 years working on it. The one tool that came along, two of them actually, that were critical and are really indispensable for anyone who's trying to create even a day ride route, is the bicycle routing mechanism or application within the Google Maps app. And the really big development that came along was the development of a website which has its own bike routing app, and that's called ridewithgps.com. An individual, actually you don't even need to be a member to use their treasure chest of thousands of routes that individuals have created. But as a mapping device, its algorithm is very heavily weighted toward finding the routes between point A and point B that are best for a bicycle. And that's the tool that I use to actually create the paper documents.
Yeah, and what's fantastic about using that as a tool, and Google as well, is in addition to having these fabulous cue sheets, which are, sort of the classic way of being able to route yourself across a country as an independent, unsupported rider, you've also got this into the Ride with GPS app as well. So if someone is a little bit more on the high tech side of things, they can have that all loaded up on their iPhone or their Android phone and be able to ride this route with turn-by-turn directions. So that's a really significant added on, I think, for what you've done as well.
It's very different, very, very much to the point. I'm not a high-tech rider myself, but I know that people do want GPX and some other types of digital files. And, when it's in the treasure chest of Ride with GPS, all that's available. They could even go in and reverse the route if they, up to this point, I've only done the westbound documentation. But they could download the files from Ride with GPS, and they can simply go in and edit and reverse the route if they wanted. So that's no small thing. One of the really big tools for Google, and actually Ride with GPS as well, is the ability for me or anyone to use the Street View, which is how I actually scouted the route in terms of, traffic, shoulders, safety, scenery, that whole thing. Because I could not get out there on the road as I normally would have done and scouted the route. And so basically I have, in a sense, vicariously ridden the route pretty much all the way using Street View, which is time-consuming, but it's very reassuring because I really would have been reluctant to put this thing out there for people without having some sense that I was offering them something safe.
I have to confess, I've done the exact same things when I've done routes, particularly out west, when it's something that I've never been on before, just to visualize it a little bit. It's a really, really helpful tool. So to be able to build a route the way that you have without actually having ridden it and use those street mapping tools, and that Street View tool, that's just fantastic. It's really quite remarkable, actually, I think.
Yes.
I'm curious, it sounds like the advent of, the idea here was the completion of the C&O linking with the GAP, which I talk about constantly on the show because, as most people know who listen to the show, I live here in Washington, D.C. as well. I'm curious, did the Katy Trail come into this as well? Because it strikes me that the two big chunks of mileage that are off-road are the Katy Trail and the C&O and GAP. Were you looking at those two things and looking at a way to link them together as a part of this route, or did it just sort of happen automatically as you kept continuing to go west on the route as you were developing it?
It wasn't as magical as it might sound. Once I got the route to the Mississippi River on the banks of Illinois across from Missouri, by happenstance and good luck, the Adventure Cycling Association had already mapped a route, the Lewis and Clark route, that started on the Illinois shore of the Mississippi and actually went through Atchison. So basically the route, and it uses the Katy Trail. So all of that research was done. All I needed to do was to plug in that segment. So basically you're riding the Lewis and Clark bicycle route, which is fully approved and mapped by Adventure Cycling, all the way from Alton, Illinois, or at least the Illinois shore of the Mississippi, to crossing the Missouri River in Atchison, Kansas.
Gotcha. So the idea here was you only reinvented the wheel for the parts that were necessary, and then through the happenstance of arriving at the right part of Illinois, it hooked up with a pre-existing route, so it was able to go from there. Does that sound about right?
That's right. The part of the route between Pittsburgh and the Mississippi River was determined by several things. First of all, there was a nice rail trail west of Pittsburgh that went almost to Steubenville, Ohio, on the Ohio River, called the Panhandle Trail. And from Steubenville across, you're sort of almost automatically having to follow the I-70 corridor, obviously not paralleling it, but what I finally decided, ideally, the typical daily mileage on an adventure cycling trip or on any other tour that I've done is ranges from 60 to 70 miles a day, assuming the terrain's not severe. And so I was looking for ways to have that kind of a sort of daily interval where you could end up someplace where you had both a camping and an indoor overnight lodging option. And it happened that I discovered when you look at the big map that the state of Ohio and Indiana both have a nice set of state parks with beautiful facilities that happen to be that distance apart. So then you connect the dots with the back roads.
It's almost like they built it for us, right?
Almost. But it's really nice. The Ohio state parks in particular they have conference lodges and indoor lodging as well as campgrounds. So that works out perfectly, and it keeps you off the interstates.
Do you happen to know, do Ohio and Indiana and those state parks have hiker-biker setups, or is it sort of the more typical car camping setup? Because I know that can matter in terms of facilities for folks who are on bicycles.
Yeah, there are a couple of places that have either biker-hiker sites or places that are basically what they call carry-in, non-car camping sites. The nice part was that every one of the grounds I found did have showers, which is, the one nice amenity, as you know, that every cyclist likes at the end of the day.
Particularly in the summer.
Especially.
Yeah, it can be humid, and a shower at the end of the day is very good.
Yes.
Frank, I think the best way that I would characterize this route right now is that it feels like it's in what I would call a public beta right now, and that you're looking for people to ride this route and give you comments, and also to have folks who live in the areas around this route to give comments. Is that a characterization that you'd say is correct?
That's absolutely right. I put it out there feeling about 90% confident that the route would work. And what I'm hoping is that by getting feedback from people who ride the route or who live in those areas, that you'll have a route that's really nailed down and is really enjoyable. The one example I can give is that I was unsure about the routing through or around Pittsburgh, which is it's both hilly and it's very traffic intensive. And so I sent an email to the local area bicycling club, and they came back with fabulous ride with GPS files and all sorts of other things, and said, the route that I initially proposed in one segment was sort of a death trap because it's not obvious. And they also provided me with a circular route that you can use if you want to simply bypass Pittsburgh and circle around it on a dedicated rail trail. So, and I've gotten feedback already from a few people who said, hey, I live in this area. And if you take this route instead of that route, you're going to avoid rumble strips and heavy traffic and that sort of thing. So the crowdsourcing mechanism offered by the internet is just invaluable. There are, in addition, at least a dozen people who have told me so far by email that they plan to ride some or all of it this summer, and that they'll be giving me reports back, which is fantastic.
I think that that's a really critical piece. So I want to make sure that everybody who's listening to this, who's interested in writing some of this, knows what they can do to help out with this process. It looks like that going through the website, easternexpressroute.com, you've got a mechanism there for folks to report new ideas or give reports on the riding of the route, things like that. Is that probably the best way folks can help out?
That's correct. And I do try to reply within a day to acknowledge or to engage in a discussion. So it's what's called the blog page. And somewhere on the website is my personal email is also available. And I'm perfectly happy to get emails and have a discussion with people.
And that's how we got in touch. So
indeed.
So thanks for responding to that. I'm curious, do you have any other recommendations that might be different from the sort of quote unquote usual routes out there in the U.S.? Is there something else that catches your eye in the same way as this Eastern Express route?
You mean in terms of perhaps the next project?
Yeah, the next project, something else that has your eye. I mean, this is a lot. Don't get me wrong. I mean, this is a fantastic amount of work, but I'm curious if there's something else that's caught your eye.
I think my only observation would be what any experienced bike touring or even bike riding person would know is that finding bicycle appropriate roads is getting harder and harder. Between the fact that most DOTs seem to feel that they have to use their rumble strip machines, regardless of whether it's necessary, the condition of the roads which haven't been maintained, and the main thing is, as I said, in the rural areas where you'd really love to ride, the small mom and pop stores are going away, the restaurants, the cafes, even the convenience stores in some cases. And it makes it hard. I mean, you can pick out a route, and then when you go and, look at it on Street View or something, you're going for, perhaps a whole day's ride with absolutely nothing in between, including no water stops. So I think that's becoming the big challenge. Small town America is not in good shape, and that means that, the options for really nice rural bicycle riding are just becoming challenging logistically.
Yeah, I hear you on all that. And my hope is that bicycle touring as an economic engine can hopefully help support some of these places and continue to have them be offered in these small towns. I think that that's certainly something that has been studied and looked at. And hopefully we can help that along by continuing to go out and doing these great cross-country rides and helping out wherever we can. I'm buying my candy bar and my Gatorade every few miles on some of these longer days. It's a little bit, but hopefully it helps.
Yeah, one of the specific things that Adventure Cycling, in fact, has done is to take and gather the research on the economic impact of bicycle travel and tourism, and it's pretty impressive. We're not, huge numbers that go through any particular town, but we certainly affect any given region rather substantially.
Yeah, there's no doubt when you look at some of the towns that are well-traveled bicycle routes that there is a huge impact by the riders that are there. So I think it's something that we can at least hang our hat on in terms of economic development and arguments for making sure that roads are built in a way that can accommodate bicycles. So that's my best pitch, at least. So
very good.
Frank, thanks so much for joining. Thanks so much again, easternexpressroute.com. Thanks for building this. Thanks for all the hard work. And I'm hoping that everybody who listens to this, who's anywhere near on the route, can help make this route even better by giving thoughts and ideas as well.
Well, thank you. And it's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Was so pleased to be able to share this interview with you. Frank, thank you again for inventing this, for doing all of the hard work and all of the research on this. Definitely go check it out. easternexpressroute.com. If you were considering the Trans Am this summer, I would strongly urge you to consider this as your Eastern option. I think it's fantastic. I've sung the praises of the C&O and the GAP for a long time. I've heard amazing things about the Katy Trail. I like the fact that it's a little bit quicker. I also know that, as I talked about in the interview, that reports that I get from people who do the Trans Am, some of their least favorite sections are the sections that this specifically bypasses. So consider all of this, and I would love to hear from you. And more importantly, I would encourage you, if you live along this route or if you have experience in these areas, feel free to reach out through easternexpressroute.com and let Frank know if you've got any potential changes in any of these various areas. It's amazing what he was able to do just using Google Street View and Google Maps and Ride with GPS. This is a very well thought out, really amazing looking route. And I think that with help from us and from other folks who are riding it or who have other local kind of feedback for him, this could be something that makes the Trans Am that much better. And I'm really excited to be trying out some or perhaps all of it at some point in the near future. So that is at least something on my to-do list. I've certainly done a good chunk of it with the C&O and the GAP, but I would love to get beyond that. That's certainly something that I'm thinking about. Next up on the show, connections. And I got a great email from Paula in Stockholm. She writes, I hope you are well. I listened to a podcast where you were curious about from which countries your listeners are from. Well, I'm from Sweden, Stockholm, and I really enjoy listening to you. Keep up the good work, Paula in Stockholm. Paula, thank you for writing in. Super excited to hear from folks on the international side of things. I think that prompted me to, throw it out there once again. If you are listening to this show from a place that I would consider super exotic, and I consider almost any place outside the U.S. super exotic, maybe even inside the U.S., just throw it out there. I do, however, have some data from my podcast host that gives me a little bit of an idea of kind of where all of you are listening from. And in the last, I think I mentioned this on a past show, that there was a big bump up at maybe the end of last year to the beginning of this year where kind of the listenership really took a big jump. So I'm really excited about that. That means something good is happening here. And I thought I would share where you are all coming from. Perhaps it's not too surprising most of you are from the United States. All 50 states listen, and that even includes you, Wyoming. Even though someone has to be last, you are beautiful and windy, and you are Cowboy State listeners, and I like all of you, and I can count you on one hand, I think. But Wyoming, you listen, as does every other state in the union, including the District of Columbia. We are not a state, but we are happy. All right, the top states. A little drum roll. All right, we're going to, we're not going to do it from reverse. We'll do it from number 1 on down. I'm just going to give you the top, I think, 4 or 5 here. Number 1, Oregon. Wonder why. Number 2, the great state of California, the Golden State. Number 3, my very own home and place of birth, the Empire State, New York. Number 4, Illinois. I think that's the biggest surprise to me. I don't believe I have heard from anybody, at least that has specifically said that they are from Illinois. I know you're out there because you're listening. I have proof of that. But hello, Illinois. That was a bit of a surprise to me. And then at last in the top 5 here, Texas, because apparently everything is bigger in Texas. Interesting. Oregon, California, New York, Illinois, and Texas are my top 5 downloads for the show. So greetings to all of you, and hello, Wyoming as well. International. This was the most interesting part. Obviously, this is an English-speaking podcast. And you do not want to hear my German nor my Japanese, both of which are terrible. And my French is even worse. I speak barely any of those languages, which is why I even mention it. I have no idea. But internationally, about 25% of the US downloads equals the number of people in our number 1 position internationally, and those are you wonderful folks in the United Kingdom. So hello, England, hello, Scotland, hello, the rest of you. Number 2 on the list, about 7% of the US downloads is Canada, which surprises me, Canada. I've bicycled through you. I have I speak your praises. I praise you often. I need more of you to listen. So Canadians share with other Canadians. That's about 7% of the total US downloads. And I just use that for comparison's sake. In number 3, Australia. Number 4, Sweden. Hello, Sweden, the country of origin for this entire discussion here. My folks in the Republic of Ireland come in next, then followed in, and these are all in order. Now we're starting to get into smaller numbers. New Zealand, hello, Kiwis. Germany, China, Netherlands, and Japan. So that's kind of a fun mix there. And of course, this is always changing as we get new folks coming in and listening as well. But trust me, when I first started the show, and we're looking at, 3 years next month, I did not think for a second that this would have grown the way that it has, that I'd get this degree of spread throughout the United States, this degree of international listenership. I mean, I've been doing podcasting for a long time, but this is exciting. And it truly, I think I try to thank everybody as often as possible, perhaps on every episode. If I miss one, I apologize for that. I thank you for all listening and for being a part of all this, because frankly, it's a lot of fun and it's really cool. And a lot of you are able to help make this possible through things like the Pedalshift Society and things along those lines. So thank you all for listening, for contributing, for all of those types of things. One other thing I wanted to mention was I also hear from members of the U.S. military who have listened to the show while they're stationed in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And I have to say, if this dopey little show about riding bikes helps pass any kind of time while you were serving, trust me when I say it is literally the least that I can do. So thank you all for listening. If you're listening from an exotic spot, and when I say an exotic spot, I mean an exotic spot for me, drop me a line or leave a note in the comments or call the Pedalshift hotline. It's actually there. I have a voicemail. It's the lightly used Pedalshift voicemail. You can go check that out in the show notes. That's pedalshift.net/079. We like to close out the show with a big thank you to all of the supporters of the Pedalshift Society. If you like what you hear, you can help me keep the show listener supported and possibly expanding the offerings. We're talking a few bucks a month. You can do some one-shot support. It's all there. If you're not into the small monthly thing, go check it out. pedalshift.net/society. And of course, go check out pedalshift.net/stickers. And you can wait for an interminably long time until I buy stamps and get you those stickers. On to the society. Ethan Georgie, Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lane, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Josiah Matthews, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittus, Thomas Skadow, Seth Krieger, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Noah Schroer, Harry Telgadas, John Sikorsky, Richard Killian, Chris Barron, Scott Taylor, Brian Wren, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Paul Mulvey, Stuart Buchan, Todd Stutz, Mr. T, Roxy Arning, Nathan Poulton, and new to this episode, Derek Wagoner and Harry Hugel, and all anonymous and past contributors for helping make this show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net. Lots of great content. You can hear the Pedalshift Project through iTunes or your favorite podcast aggregator. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his debut album. Track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Habitat, wherever cool music is available.